It began like any other morning in the courthouse. Another case, another defendant, another judge certain he already knew the outcome before a single word was uttered. But this wasn't just another elderly man facing trial. No, the man standing before them carried more than the weathered lines etched into his face. He carried a truth potent enough to fracture the very foundation of the system that sought to erase him. What followed wasn't merely a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a collision of hubris and resilience, arrogance and history. And when the dust settled, someone would emerge forever changed. But it wouldn't be him. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens when the power that always assumed it would prevail finally meets its match. Before we dive in, let us know what time you're tuning in and where you're joining us from. Drop it in the comments below. We love seeing where our community gathers. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to like and subscribe, because trust me, they matter more than ever. There's a silence in stories like this, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that presses heavily in the air, charged with unfinished business and truths ignored for far too long. The morning sun cast thin beams of light across the chipped oak floors of the Jefferson County Courthouse in Asheville, North Carolina. The building should have felt grand, historic even, but the air inside was thick, burdened by something older than the structure itself. The trial. The crowd shifted restlessly on the creaky pews. Lawyers smoothed their ties. Clerks tapped pens against their notepads. Another case, another defendant. Another story everyone thought they already knew. And then Samuel Torres, aged 82, entered. His walk was slow but deliberate, each step grounded with purpose. His suit was simple, a navy jacket with slightly worn elbows, pressed as best he could manage. His shoes, polished but scuffed, bore the marks of long years and longer journeys. In his hand, he clutched a faded flat cap, the kind that once spoke of pride on Saturday evenings at the community hall. No one stood when he entered. No one paused their chatter. To them, he was just another old man clinging to a world that had long since moved on. From the bench, Judge Henry Caldwell glanced up briefly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. He didn't see a man with a lifetime of sacrifice, a history woven with quiet honor. He saw what he expected to see, a worn-out trespasser wasting the court's time. Case number 472B, the bailiff called, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. State of North Carolina versus Samuel Torres. Charge: unlawful occupation of condemned property. Samuel nodded respectfully and stepped toward the defense table. Alone, no lawyer at his side, no stack of papers to clutch, no family in the gallery whispering encouragement. Just a man and his unshakable resolve. The murmur in the room grew, tinged with that sharp-edged pity people carry when they think they're better than the soul they're judging. Judge Caldwell leaned back, his robe settling around him like a shield. He tapped his gavel once, twice, before speaking. Another one, he muttered under his breath, then louder. Mr. Torres, I presume you understand why you're here. Samuel looked up, his eyes steady, his hands resting lightly before him. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, just a patience born of a lifetime waiting to be truly seen. I believe I do, Your Honor, he said softly, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent smoothed by decades in the South. Caldwell chuckled, a humorless sound. Well, we'll see about that. The gallery laughed with him, the sound hollow and fleeting. They'd already written the ending to Samuel Torres' story before a single fact was laid bare. But Samuel didn't flinch. He knew something the rest of the room didn't. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Samuel Torres stood at the defense table as if he'd grown roots there, calm, composed, immovable. His hands rested gently, one atop the other. No clenched fists, no fidgeting fingers betraying nerves. If the courtroom expected groveling or defiance, they'd be disappointed. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, pretending to skim the papers before him, though he wasn't really reading. He didn't need to. His mind was already made up. Let's make this quick, he said, slapping the file shut with a thud. You were found trespassing on a condemned property at 214 Maple Street. City records confirm the building was slated for demolition months ago. The words were clipped, meant to slice through any excuse before it could form. "Tell me, Mr. Torres," Caldwell said, folding his hands. "What possible reason could you have for being there?" Samuel raised his head slowly. His voice, when it came, was low but clear, cutting through the room with a weight that made people shift in their seats. "I was sitting on the steps," he said simply. "That's all." Judge Caldwell blinked, momentarily thrown by the stark simplicity of the answer. He leaned forward, his tone laced with mockery. "On the steps of a condemned house. Sentiment doesn't make it legal, Mr. Torres." Samuel didn't reply immediately. His gaze drifted to the tall, dusty windows of the courtroom, where the morning light pressed against the glass. When he spoke again, his words were quiet, almost a murmur, but the room fell silent to catch them. "It's the last place I have left," he said. "The last place that feels like mine." The gallery stirred. Some who had laughed earlier now looked down, their smugness faltering. Judge Caldwell tapped his gavel again, harder this time, masking his unease with irritation. "This courtroom isn't a therapy session, Mr. Torres. It's a place of law. Feelings don't belong here." Still, Samuel remained unmoved. His silence wasn't pleading, wasn't begging. It was a presence too solid to be swayed by sarcasm. The judge shifted in his seat, unnerved by the lack of pushback. "You were warned to stay away from that property, weren't you?" Caldwell snapped. "Yes, Your Honor," Samuel replied, unflinching. "And yet you went back." Samuel nodded once. "I did." Judge Caldwell leaned back, frustration seeping through his polished veneer. "Why?" Samuel drew a quiet breath, so faint it barely stirred the air, but it seemed to anchor him deeper into the spot where he stood. "Because a home," he said softly, "isn't something you can condemn." The words hung in the silence, heavier than any outburst could have been. Caldwell scoffed, pretending the weight of them didn't land, pretending he didn't feel the shift in the room, the way even the prosecutor paused, pen hovering, the way the clerk's typing faltered mid-sentence. "This is about facts," the judge barked, "not poetry." Samuel didn't argue, didn't defend. He simply tilted his head slightly, a small gesture of weary respect, the kind that spoke louder than any protest. To resist would have been easy, to rage easier still, but Samuel Torres had lived too long, seen too much, to waste dignity on a courtroom that had already decided who he was. Instead, he chose silence, the kind that echoes louder than any shout. Judge Caldwell, sensing he was losing an unspoken battle for control, straightened his robe and slammed the file shut. "Very well," he said. "If you have nothing further to say in your defense, we'll proceed to sentencing." The room's atmosphere tightened. Every breath was shallow, every glance darted toward Samuel. But he didn't move, didn't blink. He didn't break. Because Samuel Torres knew something the judge didn't. Dignity isn't granted in courtrooms like this. It's carried quietly, patiently, stubbornly, unapologetically. The courtroom held its breath, as if the very air was waiting to see how far things could fall. Judge Caldwell rested his elbows on the bench, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His expression wasn't one of deliberation but of a decision already sealed. He'd seen enough, heard enough, or so he thought. "The court has considered the facts," he began, his voice carrying the sharp, rehearsed tone of practiced finality. "And it's clear the defendant knowingly trespassed on city-owned, condemned property in violation of established orders." Samuel Torres stood still, his face unreadable. A single ray of sunlight from the high windows fell across his worn hands, folded patiently on the table before him. "In light of Mr. Torres's prior citation for a similar offense," Caldwell continued, "and his deliberate disregard for the law, this court finds it necessary to impose a consequence that reflects the seriousness of repeated behavior." He paused, as if expecting a reaction, a plea, a collapse, but Samuel offered none. The judge's lips tightened into a thin line. Then, with a flourish of finality, he declared, "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 45 days in the Jefferson County Detention Center, effective immediately." The words landed like a gavel strike. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the prosecutor, a young man who'd approached the case with rote detachment, froze, his pen slipping from his fingers. He opened his mouth, perhaps to object, then closed it again under the weight of the judge's authority. Samuel tilted his head slightly, not in submission but in quiet acknowledgement, as if he'd expected nothing less. Judge Caldwell leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, a smug finality in the sound. Court is adjourned. The bailiff moved towards Samuel, handcuffs dangling loosely from one hand, but Samuel didn't stir. He rose slowly from his seat, picking up his flat cap with care, as if preparing for a walk through the park rather than a march to confinement. The silence was stifling, not born of fear, but the heavy, shameful silence that follows when a room full of people realizes they've witnessed something wrong and said nothing. Judge Caldwell stacked his papers briskly, eager to move on, eager to file the morning's work under the comforting label of justice served. But he couldn't shake the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his robe. Something felt unfinished, off, incomplete. And it wasn't because of anything Isabel Torres had said. It was because of what he hadn't. As Samuel stood calmly at the defense table, waiting for the bailiff, he raised his eyes, slowly, steadily, and met Judge Caldwell's across the courtroom. He didn't glare, didn't plead. He simply looked at the man who had weighed him, measured him, and dismissed him without a second thought. And in that look, there was no hatred, only a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any shouted curse could have. Judge Caldwell looked away first. The bailiff stepped forward, hesitating just a fraction longer than procedure demanded before finally raising the cuffs. "Any last words?" he muttered almost kindly. Samuel smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. "Not yet," he said, and as the cold metal clicked around his wrists, Samuel Torres understood better than anyone in that room. Sometimes the truest verdict isn't delivered by a judge. It's delivered by time. And time, unlike the law, doesn't forget. The courtroom began to stir uneasily. The momentary silence fractured into scattered murmurs and low conversation. Papers rustled. Chairs scraped against the floor. The bailiff gave a gentle tug on Samuel's arm, signaling it was time to move. But Samuel didn't follow immediately. Instead, he turned quietly toward the bench, his voice cutting through the noise with steady softness. "Your Honor," he said, inclining his head with the kind of respect born not of fear but of deep-rooted habit. "Before I'm taken away, may I request one thing?" Judge Caldwell, already itching to clear the morning's docket, barely masked his impatience. "And what's that, Mr. Torres?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "A phone call," Samuel said simply. "Please." The request, so ordinary, so routine, almost amused the judge. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "You want to call someone now? Bit late for that, isn't it?" Samuel didn't react to the jab. He stood waiting, the picture of quiet resolve. The judge waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. One call. 1 minute. Bailiff, give him your phone." The bailiff hesitated a moment longer than necessary, then pulled a battered service phone from his belt and handed it over. Samuel took the device gently, cradling it like something fragile. His hands, marked by age but steady, moved with certainty as he dialed from memory. No contact list, no hesitation, just numbers carved into his mind like a vow. The room's attention, which had drifted moments before, began to refocus. There was something about the way Samuel stood, something about the gravity of the call, that drew eyes back to him. Ring, ring, click. Connection. Samuel raised the phone to his ear, his voice so low it barely stirred the air, yet it carried to every corner of the courtroom. "It's time," he said. "Bring them." For words, no more, no less. He ended the call without another sound, handed the phone back with a polite nod, and returned his hands to the front of his jacket, folding them once more with meticulous care. The bailiff stared at him a moment longer than protocol advised, then gestured toward the exit. But the energy in the room had shifted. It was subtle at first, a tightening of shoulders, a hitch in breathing, the prickling sense that something was coming. Even the most distracted onlookers felt it. Judge Caldwell felt it too, though he stubbornly tried to ignore it. He stacked the next case file with too much force, papers sliding out of alignment as he muttered under his breath. "Probably calling for a ride," he said, forcing a laugh that only he found funny. "Or someone to cry to." He didn't notice the bailiff didn't laugh. He didn't see the prosecutor glancing nervously toward the courtroom doors. He didn't acknowledge the way the gallery leaned slightly forward, unconsciously bracing for something they couldn't name. Because Judge Caldwell still believed the story was over, that the old man would be quietly led away, processed, forgotten. But Samuel Torres hadn't made that call out of desperation. He'd made it out of certainty. As he was escorted toward the exit, his back straight, his pace unhurried, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of defiance. It was a smile of knowing. The kind of smile a man carries when he understands the tides are already turning, even if those seated high on their benches are too blind to feel it yet. And beyond those heavy courtroom doors, the change was already lacing up its boots. It was coming. It was close. And it carried the name of Samuel Torres on its breath. The courtroom had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm. The next case file landed with a thud on Judge Caldwell's bench. Murmurs resumed. Pens scratched half-hearted notes on legal pads. Samuel Torres was nearly at the door now, led by the bailiff with slow, reluctant steps. His figure remained upright, unyielding, as if 45 days in a cell were nothing compared to the decades he'd already endured. Then it happened. The sharp, deliberate click of heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the courthouse corridor. Click, click, click. The rhythm was so precise, so purposeful. It sliced through the ambient noise like a blade. Heads turned. Conversation halted. Even the bailiff froze mid-step. Then the heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open with a sudden, forceful boom that sucked the air from the room. Standing in the doorway was a woman, tall, poised, commanding. Her charcoal suit was crisp, every line tailored to perfection, every button gleaming under the courtroom lights. A sleek leather briefcase hung from one hand, the other resting casually at her side, exuding control without a word. Her name was Dr. Isabel Torres, Samuel's daughter, but she was far more than that. A constitutional law scholar, a decorated civil rights attorney, a policy advisor whose name opened doors in D.C. and silenced boardrooms in New York. And today, she wasn't here as a guest, not as a witness, but as a force of reckoning. Behind her flowed a team, for attorneys in matching charcoal suits, each carrying case files and laptops. Their presence rippled through the gallery like an approaching storm. The courtroom froze. Judge Caldwell's pen hung in midair. His smugness faltered for a fleeting second before he recovered, straightening his robe and leaning back in his chair. "Excuse me," he called out, forcing a tone of authority that no longer held sway. "This proceeding is concluded." Isabel Torres didn't break her stride. She walked straight down the center aisle, each step measured, unhurried, inevitable. The courtroom parted around her, as if the very walls understood she was not to be delayed. She reached her father first. Samuel turned, and for a moment, no words passed between them. None were needed. Isabel placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, grounding him, honoring him. Then she raised her eyes and locked them with Judge Caldwell's. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing clear through the stunned silence. "Before you proceed further, there are documents you need to review." She lifted the briefcase with one hand, as if it weighed nothing, but everyone in that room, including the man behind the bench, knew it carried the weight of truth. And truth, once it walks through the door, doesn't knock. It enters, claims. It changes everything. Judge Caldwell shifted in his seat, his posture stiffening as Isabel Torres approached the bench. Without waiting for permission, she placed a thick folder on the polished wood. The thud echoed louder than any gavel. "These are certified documents," she said, her voice unwavering. "They pertain to the property and its legal status." Caldwell's fingers hesitated over the folder. Around the room, A collective breath seemed to catch. Spectators, lawyers, even clerks leaned forward, drawn to whatever invisible line had just been crossed. Slowly, the judge opened the folder. The first page alone was enough to make his jaw clench. Deeds, titles, historical records, legal affirmations, all bearing an undeniable truth. The house at 214 Maple Street, the house Samuel Torres had been accused of illegally occupying, had never been fully transferred to city ownership. The title, tangled in bureaucratic oversight and neglect, still legally belonged to Samuel Torres. And there was more. Records of Samuel's service as a Vietnam War veteran, certifications as a civil engineer, commendations for his work rebuilding communities after hurricanes and floods. Samuel Torres wasn't just another tired old man. He was a cornerstone the city had once leaned on, a man whose labor had paved the roads they drove, whose ingenuity had kept the lights on during crises. Judge Caldwell's face drained of color as he turned page after page. The weight of his assumptions crumbled faster than he could process. Before him, Isabel stood resolute, her arms calmly crossed. Beside her, Samuel remained silent, hands clasped before him, wearing the same quiet dignity he'd carried all morning. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled, just the slow, devastating unveiling of truth. A truth the judge had refused to consider. A truth that now laid bare every inch of his prejudice to a room that had once laughed with him. Around them, the courtroom shifted from judgment to shame, from certainty to regret. The system hadn't just failed Samuel Torres. It had tried to erase him, and it had done so with the cruel indifference of those too blind to look twice. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, the sound fragile in the heavy silence. He looked at Isabel, then at Samuel, and for the first time that morning, his voice wavered. "We may need to revisit this matter," he said quietly. But everyone in that room already knew. The matter had already shifted. The walls had already cracked. And nothing could hold the truth back now. The courtroom no longer belonged to Judge Caldwell. It belonged to the truth. Isabel Torres stood tall, her composure unshaken, needing no apologies, seeking no permission. Samuel stood beside her, his presence quiet but towering, his silence louder now than any verdict could ever be. Judge Caldwell searched for words but found none that could mend the fractures widening beneath his authority. With a clipped voice, he announced, "In light of the new evidence presented, the sentencing against Mr. Torres is vacated. All charges are dismissed effective immediately." The gavel fell with a hollow thud. No one cheered. No one clapped. The weight of shame hung too thick in the air. The bailiff, who had moved to restrain Samuel moments before, now stepped back, almost deferentially. Even the young prosecutor, pale and tight-lipped, averted his eyes. Samuel Torres slowly straightened his wrists, now free, his spirit unbroken. He turned to the gallery, not to gloat, but to remind them of something they'd nearly forgotten. Respect isn't granted by institutions. It's commanded by presence. He met Judge Caldwell's eyes one last time, and this time it was Caldwell who looked away. Isabel touched her father's arm gently. "Let's go home," she whispered.